Ho, 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 it's Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to me do a terrible Santa impersonation. Don't worry, that won't continue, but what we will give you in this episode is our very best episodes of the year.
Yeah, thank you for joining us in this festive season, showing your dedication to the podcast. And as you are dedicated, you probably want to make sure you haven't missed any gold this year. And even if you have listened to every episode, which puts you in a special elite club if you have, then hopefully you have some time over the coming weeks to go and re-listen to an episode or two. So if you want to stick your headphones in and avoid your family, we're going to direct you to some of our favourite episodes of the year. But before we get into our favourites, Rob, let's listen to the data. The people have spoken, and our most downloaded episode of the year was 541, The Silent Property Crash.
I'm glad this was the most downloaded one because I felt this possibly might have been the most important podcast of the year. And I've recommended this podcast to so many people in passing just to help them understand what is actually happening. It's been a crazy year as we've covered on multiple occasions. But what has not been covered enough, or pretty much at all for my liking, is that we've had a silent property crash. Property prices have fallen this year a bit. Nothing dramatic, but they've fallen. But when you take into account inflation, then it's a full-on crash. But as we discussed in this episode, Rob, it's the best type of crash.
Very much so. And there's a YouTube video on the same concept as well. So we'll link to that in the show notes for this episode if you prefer to watch instead. And do subscribe to the channel while you're there, because we put a lot more effort into our YouTube channel this year, but that is just the beginning. We're taking up to a whole new level in 2024. So you'll want to be following along.
So that was our most downloaded episode. Although we must mention that our predictions episodes that we do in January were also way, way up there in the rankings. So we've got those coming back in January. So make sure you listen to those. Judging by the downloads, everyone wants to know where our hotspots are for each year. And we'll, of course, give you an updated version of that in a few weeks' time. So, Rob, they were the strong ones on downloads. What about personal favourites? What was a podcast that stood out for you?
It's tough to choose. So many I've enjoyed this year. I think this has been our best year yet. And I say that every year, which I guess is a good thing. At least we think we're getting better. But if I had to pick, which I do, I would say 545, The Worst Time to Invest is the name of that episode, where we looked into what would have happened if you'd invested in property at the absolute worst time. And the reason I love this episode is that it was taking every property investor's greatest fear and putting numbers to it. Because you know, when we're talking to people who want to get into property, one of their overriding fears is, oh, well, what if I buy and then the property market crashes the next day? And in many cases, that stops people from investing at all, because there's always some event coming up that might trigger a property price crash. Well, in this episode, we looked into what would have happened if you had bought not just in the worst year, but in the worst quarter that you possibly could have bought in the last 20 years, and what would have happened to your investment as a result. And what the data told us about that was fascinating in its own right. But if this is a fear that you have, or if this is a fear someone else has, you've got a friend who keeps on talking about getting into property but can't quite bring themselves to do it, point them towards this episode because it's a real eye-opener. So that's mine, Rob. What's yours?
I really enjoyed recording episode 542, which we called Is the 18-Year Property Cycle Dead? Because we have really promoted the 18-year property cycle in the UK. In fact, if you search for it on Google, most of the stuff is us. We've really brought the awareness of the 18-year property cycle to many property investors. But it's been a funny year. It's been a funny period. And more recently, we've had COVID as well. So the property market's been all over the place. So we wanted to answer, is the 18-year property cycle dead? And a very rare event occurred on this podcast is we didn't agree. We had a difference of opinion. So I really encourage everyone to go back and listen to that episode, particularly if you're aware of what the 18-year property cycle is, to understand both our viewpoints and most importantly, come to your own. Use the information that we give you to help you form a view. If you're familiar with this strategy, then it's a great episode. And if you're not, well, then just search for 18-year property cycle on Google and consume the endless content we've put out on that subject. But for me, this is a must listen. And maybe if the subject isn't enough, just hearing Rob and I disagree on something is probably interesting as well. But Rob, we couldn't leave it at just our picks. Of course, producer Dan sits silently in the background, but is a big part of this podcast, and he has his favourite as well. And he's picked out another pod to add to the list.
Yep, there is at least one poor person who's been forced to listen to every episode this year, so Dan definitely deserves his vote. And he's picked out episode 535, The Monopoly Strategy, which is where Rob described his current strategy, how it's evolved over time, and where he's ultimately going. And this has sparked something in a lot of people. In speaking to clients and going to our Property Hub Select events and talking to people who listen to the show, people have started talking about the Monopoly strategy. And I think it might be because it's tapping into the ultimate purpose, and it shows one person's roadmap to take property and over time get to a very motivating outcome. So the point of this episode isn't, here's what I'm doing, you must copy it. But it's, here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing it and how I'm thinking about it and how I came to this strategy. And that gives anyone a great framework to take that same method and apply it to their own goals.
So there you have it. You have our most listened to episode and you have our picks. And also really popular this year on the downloads were the market updates and the mortgage updates. Now, you don't need to go back and listen to those, but make sure when you see them land in your feeds that you consume them as well. Many others are, because it keeps you up to date with what is happening in the market right now. So they were also very, very popular when we looked at the downloads. And you know who's popular? You are with us, because you have listened to this episode just before Christmas. You are wanting to know the very best of what we've done this year. And that is awesome. Thank you so much. If you want to give us a little Christmas present, then a review is always greatly appreciated. But you don't have to. Just being here is enough. Thank you. And share it with others. Give them the Christmas present of the Property Podcast. Yeah, it's a lot cheaper as well. Imagine unwrapping a present on Christmas Day and it's a piece of paper with a link to the Property Podcast. What a gift you've given them, and it's cost you nothing. It might mean that you're not invited back next year if you're visiting someone, but still, you've still helped them. So that just leaves us to say, have a wonderful Christmas or holiday, wherever you celebrate. Just have a great time, relax, use it wisely. Let's all re-energize for 2024. We're going to bring you our best stuff. We're going to keep trying to improve, and I know you will too. So together, let's do it. Have an amazing Christmas. Happy holidays, everyone. We'll be back next week with a little pod to keep you entertained between Christmas and New Year. But until then, take care, have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.